one little seed that puts out roots, that starts to spread its little roots throughout the ground, can do anything. A tiny little seed over time with the right nourishment and the right environment can shift cities. So I want to be on that journey, not just with a whole bunch of social entrepreneurs and not just creating opportunities for young people who really need them, but with the rest of us who want to have our hand down in the soil and want to be wearing gumboots in this city. So I'm hoping that you all will be on that journey as well. And if that's something that you get really excited about, please come and talk to me, because we'll find a way for you to be involved in it too. Thanks.
Fantastic. I'm going to get my gumboots. I love the sounds of that.
I think the city could supply us with gumboots. Like, you're welcome.
Right.
You're welcome to the cities, a new pair of gumboots.
Love it. Great, thank you. And continuing our food theme, Pat, over to you.
What a stitch up, Sally. If any of you here are ever thinking about joining a panel and you happen to follow Jeremy and Beck, what a bloody stitch up. I'm not an architect or a scientist, and I haven't affected that much social change that I'm aware of. In fact, I used to be a professional fancy man, you know, waving my jazz hands around, a restaurant critic and a magazine editor. And I was here in Melbourne in my capacity as a professional fancy man a few years ago when the foodorati of the world descended on the city for the world's 50 best restaurants right here in Australia, a proud moment in Australian gastronomy. And in my capacity as a professional fancy man, it was my happy duty to show people around. So I had, you know, fellow fancy men, women and others from Beirut, from Paris, from Rome, from Texas. I just made the Texas up, but they were from all over the place, you know, very worldly, fancy people. And we went to fancy places and we ate some fancy things and we drank some fancy things, and it was a fancy old time, Lord Mayor. It was great. And after this, you know, orgy of fanciness, I had a chat to them afterwards and I said, "What did you think?" And they said, "Yeah, look, you know, the fancy restaurants are great. You know, like, your restaurants are as fancy as anything in the world. Your wine is wonderful. You know, coffee, you're the great coffee bores of the world. But what we really like is the way you actually live. We like the way you eat and drink every day in Melbourne. We've got fancy restaurants back in Beirut and Paris and Texas, probably. But what we really admire is the fact that eating and drinking well is something that everyone in Melbourne seems to be interested in. You know, and we think this is not what we expect from you in the English-speaking world. You know, this is not how it's done. I think what we have in Melbourne is unique. I think that we have the fancy restaurants. We have that. We have even non-fancy restaurants. We have a robust and interesting enough food scene here that can support restaurants that, you know, do the food of one city from Italy or one city from Vietnam. We have bars that just do non-alcoholic drinks. That's pretty out there. But it's not just restaurants. It's the food that people in Melbourne eat and drink and cook and buy every day. So last year, or over the last year, I got to know the 5 kilometres around my house quite well. I'm sure many of you did. In my 5 kilometres, I can buy a rooster. I can buy fresh yeast. I can buy black cardamom and green hazelnuts. I know where to get bread from Ethiopia, and I know where to get noodles from China, all within my 5 kilometres. And I can tell you, I'm a newly minted Melburnian. I've only lived here for 2 years. Great time to come down and get into the events business and move to Victoria. Couldn't have timed it better. But I can tell you that it's not like this in the rest of Australia. It's not like this in any other Australian city. And I think it's probably safe to say that it's, you know, not like this in pretty much the rest of the world. We need to savour this. We need to treasure this. And we need to protect this. I think I have a segue here somewhere. Bear with me. But if you live in Melbourne, and you know, I assume most of you do live in Melbourne, you know this. I don't need to tell you that food and hospitality are very frequently the anchors for communities, the places where neighbourhoods grow. And it might not be the food, you know, it's the people as much as anything else. It's who gets together at the table. But who has a seat at the table? And I think both of you have touched on this. I mean, my job at the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, again, there's a certain amount of fancy man work involved with that. But in the festival that we were going to be bringing to life almost exactly 1 year ago this week, we were doing things differently. We were very interested in maybe making the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival even more Melbourne, you know, so we were going to take all the exciting chefs visiting from around the world and we were going to make all their talks free. So we took them out of the auditoriums and out of the restaurants and we put them into the Queen Victoria Market. Anyone, your clients or colleagues at Street, Beck, you mentioned before that maybe the people you work with can't afford to go to the kind of events we do at the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, but a festival that truly celebrates the food and wine of Melbourne is one that's available to everyone. And for that, we need a food and drink scene that is available to everyone. The novelist William Gibson wrote that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. Looking at the speakers here and thinking of Joost, wherever he is, wrestling yabbies back in the tank at Future Food Systems right now, you could argue that we have the technology, we have the ideas, we have the people, we have the rewildlings, we have the buildings, we have the will. We just need to bring these things together. We need to share our knowledge about our food systems. We need to share the exact information that you guys talked about, the fact that we need to protect our peri-urban farming. And we need to make sure that the people who bring the food to our tables are recognised and protected as well. We need to strengthen what we have in drawing people back to hospitality. You know, there's never been a harder time to get staff in hospitality. It was the hardest thing in hospitality before the pandemic hit, and now it's the hardest thing minus Danny Valent. You're in the crowd here. How many temporary visa workers did we shed in Australia last year? I think it was 600,000 temporary visa holders in total, and a very large number of that number came from hospitality and tourism. What I think we need in Victorian hospitality, and you know, as a part of the City of Melbourne, is we need to invest in making hospitality a place where you don't just feel safe and secure to work, but you feel proud. The next Melbourne is already here. We just have to make sure that everyone has access to it.
Brilliant. Well, what a great way to kick off a conversation. Thank you. You're pretty good at responding to stitch-ups, Pat. That was fantastic. Well, look, thanks to all the speakers. I'm going to kick off with a question each, but really keen if you've got questions, you can start to let me know with a nod, a wink, or hand up, traditional way, and I will come to you next. I'm going to go back to Jeremy for a moment. On the league tables of most densely populated cities in the world, Manila is leading the way at the moment with 46,178 people per square kilometre. We've then got cities that I think we all love to go to and we admire, like Paris, which is around 21,000 people per square kilometre, and New York, which is about 19,000 people per square kilometre. Based on our city of Melbourne, so our municipality, 37.5 square kilometres, about 180,000 people. We're at 4,800 people per square kilometre, so still a long way to go. You touched on a theme earlier. I call it density done well. 83% of our population currently lives in a multi-storey dwelling of some sort. Tell us, well, often the feedback comes to me that we already are too overpopulated within the city, and yet we know we've got two big urban renewal areas such as Fisherman's Bend and Arden. I feel like we've got space to grow, but we want to grow well. Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on density done well, and what is the capacity that we have in Melbourne to do that?
Thanks, Sally. Or should I change back? Thanks, Sally. Look, the interesting thing is that there's no equity to the way that our city works. So at the south end of our city, in South Bank, our density is denser than New York. Whereas, in Craigieburn, our density is, lower than just about Texas. Let's talk about Houston. So there's this interesting problem that we've got with incredible urban compression, with people stacked vertically, and then incredible urban sprawl, where people are building where we should be growing our food. And what we do know is that the further someone lives from the city, the lower their chances are in life. So they require 2 cars per household. They spend a lot of their time tied up in a car each way. And the average cost of running a car, last time ABS checked, was $10,500 a year, including depreciation. And so when you're on a low income, or you're a hospitality worker with no fixed income or guarantee to that income, it becomes incredibly problematic. We know that at the city's edges in very low density, that there's low social capital. And what that is, the ability for people to be able to access work, the opportunity for work, the opportunity for social connection, the opportunity for study, the opportunity for basic things like a medical centre, a dentist, a place that you can walk to buy some milk and bread without having to require a car to get in there, to drive 5 kilometres to buy a loaf of bread and a litre of milk. And then if we think about, cities like Paris, 6, 7 and 8 stories, and what an incredible city it is. And if you think about that, the place that is now heritage listed, that we all look to as like an icon in the world, Paris had to adopt massive change in the late 1850s. So it was a city that was, bursting at the seams. It was largely 2 and 3 stories. They had a population problem. They had a health problem. And large parts of Paris were replanned, demolished and rebuilt. And there was massive outcry at the time. And obviously the old Marais district in Paris is still, the old Gothic part, which is still incredibly beautiful. But what resulted in Paris was, 6 stories, 7 stories and 8 stories. Separation between those buildings, good access to natural light and ventilation, and Florence Nightingale will tell you that's very good for your health. And beyond that, the other thing that happened with Paris post that was an incredible amount of accommodation. And with that accommodation, the price of housing in Paris went down, and people from all around Europe flocked to Paris as the place to be. And so following the rebuilding of Paris, that's when Toulouse-Lautrec turned up in Paris. That's when everyone flocked to Paris. That's when Paris became the arts and the thinking capital, the intellectual capital of Europe. And I think that Melbourne has that opportunity. I think there's plenty of vacant space in the Docklands, Sally, that if we offered at concessional rents to artists, thinkers, people at an affordable rent, if we weren't driven by some economic system, instead we were thinking about social capital, I think that we'd really start to re-engineer the place that Melbourne is. And, as you said, Pat, it's already an incredible place. So I think that, the problem for us is that Melbourne has density done generally very poorly, and there are examples of it done well. And I think that Rob Adams and your city design team had it right, 20 years ago when they said it should be, along major transport corridors, and it should be about, 6 stories, and we can handle our density growth really well at a similar density to Copenhagen.
Fantastic. Some good themes we can come back to there, and particularly given just some quick stats. So here in Docklands, on a normal day, it's been our fastest growing employment precinct. So pre-COVID, there'd be 72,000 workers coming into this precinct, and there are about 12,000 residents. So very much an employment zone. If we accept, as we should, that the way that we work has changed forever in good ways. We've been looking for flexible working, remote working for decades now, and COVID's really accelerated that. What does it mean for the spaces here and how we can repurpose some of those as well? I know that excites you, Jeremy, but it'd be good to get some of those conversations going. We're certainly getting lots of suggestions at the City of Melbourne. And then just lastly on that, there are 47% of the shop fronts in Docklands now empty due to businesses that haven't been able to survive through COVID. And that sense of devastation that comes through empty spaces then impacts everybody else who's still trying to have a go. So how do we quickly pirouette, I call it, instead of pivot, I got over that word, pirouette to activating those spaces. And we agreed to a program this week at Council to invest, and we're now looking for ideas on how we can pirouette in that way. So we'd love any ideas about that as well. Just to come to Beck, giving you some warning, we loved that visualisation of you flying into the city from Mount Baw of what we could be. And to go to another end of the scale, each spring in the city outside Town Hall, we have these mini farms that are in big pots. And we grow corn and pumpkins and zucchinis and tomatoes and peas. Birds come, insects come, people come, herbs, lettuces, spinach. It's a tiny little micro farm which has all of these brilliant benefits, not least of which are the smells and the sounds and, of course, the tastes. Always wash first, but you are welcome to take the produce. So we see these micro farms. We have your vision of what the city could be when it is a farm again. Tell us about what you may have seen at scale here or other places around the world, and how do you see that we can build scale, because it can actually come from a lot of micro farms based on what I heard you say earlier.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about different places I've been overseas, I think about travelling to LA many, many years ago and standing outside the LA Town Hall. And it was this gigantic piece of concrete, but what they had done is rebuilt a victory garden. The kind of victory gardens that were built during the wartime, that was, just the whole of this part of LA was just an enormous garden. And it was a garden that was on an artificial structure. It was straight down onto the concrete. But if I think about, some of the social enterprises around the world, there's a really beautiful one in Vancouver called Hope Street Farms. It's got phenomenal amount of contaminated land that it's essentially grown new wicking beds on top of. And so all of that contaminated land now is growing this incredible regenerative kind of produce that goes into top restaurants kind of around the city. But it's also a training and employment venue for people who really need a hand. If I think about sitting in Tempelhofer Garden in Berlin, many of you have probably been there, but that's a garden, community garden, an enormous kind of environmental park that you will equally be sitting, playing your guitar as your family will be sitting around in your little community allotment garden. There's, a walk off to one side, and there's an amazing, little telephone booth that's now a micro library, and the garden is the place where you come together as a community. So I've been to so many places around the world where the growing aspect has become part of the fabric of the city. And one of the things that when I first started Street, it was the first little food cart that I pushed out onto Federation Square in 2010. The reason why I wanted it to just be street food and in public space was because I'd been living in Vietnam, and I saw again and again how a community comes together over food. You don't cook your breakfast, in your house, but what you do is, even in the middle of the monsoon, you come out onto tiny little plastic blue stools and you sit out as a whole community and you share food together. And what the food did is it became the social capital. It became the way that you have conversations, the way, it's the currency of that city, because you come together 3 times a day as a community around that food rather than sitting in your house watching television. And so that preciousness, I think, of those kind of rituals that we can create around both eating and growing, I think, are really precious. If I think about the way that Indigenous communities have often used food as, this city, it's here because it was a food bowl, but it was here because we had so many different food ecosystems, down on the South Bank side. It's incredible marshland with all of this, wetlands with all of this kind of teeming wildlife there. Where we are now was kind of far more Murnong daisy fields. But right beside us down here is, these beautiful river that had, a great big waterfall that was at Queen Street, and there was a great big waterfall there that separated out a freshwater ecosystem from a saltwater ecosystem, but we blew the whole thing up to try and get more ships being able to move up. And if I think about, ceremony and social gathering in this city for, what would be tens of thousands of years was around a food bowl. And I think that possibility of doing exactly what you were saying, Pat, keeping it as a foodie city, but how do we make it accessible? How do we make that food system inclusive? That's what I'm passionate about. The young people that we work with, and we embed into our hospitality businesses, they've come from Parkville and Malmesbury prisons. They've come from sleeping rough all around the streets of Melbourne. They've come from detox. They've come from the homelessness shelters. And I'm really interested in how do you use this food system to be the place that brings people together, because most of all, I think what food can do is it can make people belong. The richness of cultural diversity and our food reflecting our heritage, I think, gets really precious. So I think there are so many examples around the world of how communities use food for social inclusion and belonging, and we don't have to look too far. The other example I'll give is one that I would love to see the city of Melbourne adapt. Or adopt. The city, I think, has done extraordinary things. It's got this really, ambitious goal of doubling tree cover, in the next 20 years. Paris has got a really similar goal, but a third of all of that has to be edibles. So when you start to green a city, but you also embed foodscapes into that city, I think you change the nature of that city really fundamentally.
Fantastic. I'm getting excited. Pat, a couple of years ago, would it have been now? Not that long, actually. Global Table came to town, and it's was a conference, but it's a group. Well, you can talk more about it. I'll let you do that. Really dedicated to understanding. Again, here are top chefs or top restaurateurs that really appreciate that they can make a significant difference to procurement, to supply, to the way that we produce food, the way that we use food, the way that we deal with waste, that whole sort of food ecosystem. Can you give us some insights into, some of the themes coming through there and the ways in which the hospitality industry is responding to sustainability and food security?
I think, thank you, Sally. I think Global Table was an event, it's actually part of the company that Melbourne Food and Wine Festival is part of, put on, not for the public, but for people in food, people in government, everyone from supermarkets to Indigenous growers of native food. And the question at the heart of Global Table was, how do we keep feeding the world when we haven't really found a way to do that in a way that doesn't damage the world in the meantime? And I think one of the really exciting things about Global Table was that it was in Melbourne. And I think one of the questions we asked in putting that event together was, why can't Australia be the place for this conversation? Why can't Melbourne be the place leading this conversation? And just listening to, I'm going to go slightly rogue here, Sally, I'm sorry. Just listening to Beck and Jeremy today, I'm thinking of, I don't want to call them easy wins. I don't want to call them low-hanging fruit, because good things don't often come easily, but there's a lot that we can own here. There's a lot, just for a much less grand example of something a little bit closer to home for me, at the festival last year we were going to stage a plant-based party, and it just arose out of the question of where's the best vegan food or plant food party? Where's the best celebration of that in the world? I can't really answer it. Maybe Berlin, I don't know. But it should be Melbourne. It can be Melbourne. We have the roots, we have the communities, we have the reasons to make it happen. So many times I ask these questions, who's really leading conversations in First Nations food culture in the world? And, just hearing Beck speak today, you think, why couldn't Melbourne be the site for these conversations? And those two examples are very much sustainability oriented, because a plant-based diet is something really important in that argument, and obviously looking to the knowledge and involvement of First Nations people is absolutely crucial to any conversation about sustainability. Melbourne is the place for these things for so many reasons. It's not an easy win. It's not low-hanging fruit. But at the same time, it's not like we're saying, why don't we become a seaside town really famous for tiny snacks? No, that's San Sebastian. We could do that, but it would take a lot more work. Whereas these are conversations that are live in Melbourne. These are conversations that are real in Melbourne. And what I think the saying is, it's easier to make a fast horse run faster. You know, and I think we have the grounding here. So let's give it a push. Can I jump onto that, Sal?
One of the things I think is really interesting is, you know, if you take a city like ours that's been so proud of its, you know, most livable city in the world title, we know kind of from the science that the food system is the only system that you can do all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through. It's the one place that both human and planetary health collide. And so what I get excited about is how do we, you know, obviously we're facing this unbelievably catastrophic, you know, existential crisis now in the climate crisis. We're going to feel that most of all in a city, which is a heat island, you know, an extra 4 degrees in this city. But with 80% of the world living in cities in the future, you know, this is a problem that we are facing across the whole world. So how do we use the food system as that, you know, what I always think of as an acupuncture needle? You know, if we've got somewhere in a system that we're going to put an acupuncture needle to do social and environmental at the same time, you keep coming back to the food system because it's the one system that can do all of the SDGs. So I'd love to see us say, well, how do we actually use, you know, food policy as part of, you know, affecting every other policy that's there and see it as the vehicle that we're driving kind of health policy and environmental policy and all of that kind of city stuff that we need to do and that climate adaptation stuff that we have to do. So what would it look like in this city to put food front and centre and do everything else through it?
It's a great topic because as we've been looking at this reimagining of Melbourne, one of the things we're conscious of is that, of course, responding to economic hardship, given that has been so severe, is a priority. But in a sense of making sure that we remain dedicated to progress on some of the big conundrums like homelessness, for example, how do we make sure that the conversations come together? Because so often in the past the debates have been, for example, economic prosperity or environmental outcomes. They've been separate. They've been seen as one impeding the other. And yet how do we make those mutually inclusive in terms of outcomes and ways forward? And you've already touched on some of those today, whether it's how we can make projects like yours, Jeremy, actually economically viable. All of those sorts of elements of building in social and environmental outcomes has to be key. I'm looking around to see if there are any questions from the audience at this point.
Or any statements, Phil?
Go on, Phil, and then we've got a question up there. Well, voluntold. I think you were voluntold, yeah.
Thank you. And things that were sort of changing gradually, maybe over time anyway. We've had a bit of a step function change forced on us. And you mentioned the one about people working from home, which is, it's great and it's undeniably a lot better for people with young families and everything else. But we also have to protect the health of this great city. We've all recognised it is a great city. I know, you know, in the property industry, typically it used to work in major office buildings through Docklands in the city. 1.4 people per desk was the aim that most people had, which was about 70%, you know, of the population in the office at any time. Everyone's now talking about 1.7. That's 20% of the daily commuting population is gone from the city of Melbourne. And that's before we talk about tourists and students in the short term. How do we... And in order to do all this stuff that we have to do, that's just been spoken about, we still have to have a viable city. So what are the things we can do to bring people back? And I was kicking some ideas around with Jeremy the other day, and you talk about Paris, or you talk about the higher density cities. Most of them have 2 or 3 schools on every street. They're little schools, they're preschools, their primary schools. You see the kids out walking with their teachers. You know, we are going to end up with a whole lot of vacant space. You know, obviously homelessness, you know, is a big one, and that's been well discussed already. But what are the other things we can put into the city that are going to bring that population back in the short term until we have time to adapt to whatever the new city model is over time?
Do you want to kick us off with another idea?
Look, I think the schools was the big one. Obviously, you know, arts, you know, creative arts and other things. You know, the city's a really expensive place at the moment, and you know, is this a time to look back, as Jeremy said, as to how we do make it so that people that can't afford to be in the city can be. You know, Pat's discussion on the hospitality industry, you know, too. I think that is a key. And those examples, you know, I've eaten in those communal places in Shenzhen and places too, where everyone just pulls the plastic stools up and everyone eats together. I think that sort of happens a little bit. You know, I'm a Fitzroy boy nowadays, and we all eat. You know, you do your cycle of the different places you eat, and you have a different group of community that you meet at all those different venues. It is all of those sort of things. But if we don't have the population in Melbourne on a daily basis, you know, and one of the things will be too for the hospitality industry is if people are not in the office one day a week, it's highly likely going to be Friday, and that was the day when business was done for the hospitality industry. It was lunch, or people stayed in and went to a show, went to dinner, or whatever else. But I guess, Sally, the only thing I can think is we've got to get families. You know, they were probably the missing thing in the city. So how do we get our density back up by having whole families here?
Sounds good. I just thought we could go back a little bit in the early 90s when we'd gone through the financial recession here in Melbourne. You'll remember people were leaving in droves. They were going to Queensland. Does that sound familiar? Talk about history repeating itself. I was a young worker, and I actually would walk around the city in the evenings and feel that this wasn't a place that had opportunity for me as I was starting my career, which is really depressing. And we were described then, I think it might have been by a New South Wales politician, as a moribund city in a rust bucket state. From there, decades on, we've had a record run of being one of the most livable cities in the world. And it started in that crisis with these big ideas and a policy that Rob Adams had a lot to do with, but city leaders and industry leaders came together, and it's still regarded as one of the most transformational urban renewal policies, called Postcode 3000. And there were some key elements to that. One was to bring residents into the city if workers were leaving. In the mid-80s, we had 685 residents in our Hoddle Grid CBD. In the same Hoddle Grid today, there are 42,136, and they are absolutely the heartbeat and the pulse of the city day to day, and they've brought so much personality, but also confidence for all those other little businesses. Back in the early 80s, before Postcode 3000, cafes weren't allowed to have tables and chairs on the streets. Can you believe it? And that activity was brought out onto the streets, and that sense of life, and bringing what was happening inside buildings out to make it more accessible and more exciting, and literally fill our streets. And of course, outdoor dining through, as the restrictions eased last year and through to now, has been magical in terms of transforming our streets. These are the sorts of initiatives, relatively simple when you think about them on a piece of paper, but can be momentous. More schools. And I was just going to finish with artists, creative organisations, cultural organisations, social entrepreneurs. The different pricing of space in the city as we came out of that recession means that they could come in and fill, even the Nicholas building, still dedicated to artists. Other spaces around the city became filled with that creative energy and completely changed the city. And it's those sorts of activities that we can encourage again. Any other responses to Phil's question? Would anyone like to pick it up? Jeremy?
I think it's a time of incredible opportunity. So at the last census in 2016, there were 116,000 people experiencing homelessness in this country. We're one of the wealthiest countries per capita. There's no excuse for that. In Finland, there is no homelessness because when someone is experiencing homelessness, they build them a house. because they worked out in Helsinki that it costs you about $50,000 a year to house someone, but it costs you about $500,000 a year to put them in jail. And when you put someone out on the street and they don't have secure accommodation and they can't get access to food and health, they end up resorting to petty crime to be able to just house themselves and their family. So I think there's an opportunity, Sal, to actually sort that out here. You know, we need to make a decision as a society who we want to be and how we want to be and what's equitable. And the other issue is that as one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, we have some of the highest emissions, carbon emissions per capita. There's no excuse for that. And it doesn't matter what happens at a federal level, we have to make our own decision about how we're going to do that. And so I think there are incredible opportunities. And if you think about what happened in Paris, you know, at the turn of the 19th century, or the turn of the 20th century, and they reimagined themselves as an intellectual and arts capital. And I think that you're absolutely right that, you know, that Melbourne is already there, but we've got the opportunity to take it to a next level. So, you know, and the City of Melbourne already has, you know, its Creative Spaces program. It's been supporting artists. And now if we have vacant space fill, perhaps, you know, it's time for less bank employees to sit in there, but time for us to, you know, embrace our creatives and house everyone.
And give people a reason to come and visit. You know, I think we really do need to burnish brand Melbourne right now for visitors. I mean, we need it for ourselves as people who live here, but we need a little reset on the Sictoria hashtag. I think we'd be happy to see the end of that. And I want Instagram.
Wow.
Oh, it's nasty, and I don't want to see Instagram targeting me with ads encouraging me to move to Newcastle because the commute is shorter and the city is less congested.
Yeah, and their primary export is coal. Awesome.
Good. I've got a question here and then a question here. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally.
We've got a microphone coming. Thank you. Just means everybody who's watching on the live stream can hear as well.
No worries. Thank you. I think since I put my hand up, I've had about 50 different questions flow through my mind because there is so much to talk about, and yeah, the ideas are definitely sparking. But I think what I'd love to put to each of you, and I include you in this, Sally, is it's about empowerment and just, you know, some of these issues you talk about are so overwhelming and they're so huge. You guys are all real doers in your own fields, and, you know, the things that you do really ripple outwards. But I just wonder if you could, even perhaps with some concrete examples, like how can we all feel empowered that the changes that we can make in our own respective fields, that they will make a difference and set us on this path to, you know, this glittering future. And I'll fly over the city of Melbourne too and celebrate it with you back.
Firstly, for everyone, the single most important thing you can do for yourself and for your organisation is to buy 100% certified green power. So currently our energy mix is largely coal. When you buy certified green power, you are changing the energy sector to move to renewables. The second thing is pay the rent. So accept the fact that we've built this incredible city on First Nations land that was stolen through genocide. And so our organisation, and no doubt Bex does as well, we pay the rent to First Nations people, so to the land that which we're on, with the Wurundjeri people. And that's something that you can all do, and you can decide what that rent is, you know. And so it might be as little as $100 a week, it might be $100,000, you know, it might be $1 a week, whatever you can afford. But it's about acknowledging what happened and what are the steps we take forward.
Yeah, I love that. The thought that the food is the way we reconcile, I think, is quite extraordinary. Can you go next, Pat? Because I'm still thinking.
Go small. Like if you've got a choice between shopping at a supermarket or an owner-operated business down the road, go to that owner-operated business. You know, think about where you spend your money. It's basically what Jeremy's saying, and you're voting every day. You're making decisions that shape your city every day. Which businesses do you want to be here this time next year? Because right now it is absolutely critical in hospitality, but in all sorts of businesses, the dry cleaner you go to, the nail salon you go to, any of those things, you know, think about that. It's every day. what do I want in my neighbourhood? Do I still want them to be here? And start a conversation with them. They want to hear from you. The person you buy your coffee from, the person you buy your fruit and vegetables from, it starts with you. It doesn't have to be a big conversation. It can just be looking up from your phone to look them in the face and say hello and thank you. I'm sure everyone in this room and on this stream does that, but I hear that there are people who don't do that.
And it's just worth noting that Woolworth's parent company has massive holdings in gaming, and gaming in all the wrong spots. If you want to know how to destroy a community, it's having gaming in communities that can't afford it.
I'd say find your local social enterprise for sure, because they're going to be doing social and environmental at the same time. So their business models is transformative, kind of their engines essentially for doing good. The other thing that I would say is also go to your local farmers markets to buy your food. Don't go to Coles and Woolies and just prop up what's a really, really broken system. Go local, and if it means having to drive even, I hope for most people there's a local farmers markets near them, but try and go to a farmers markets and support, fair regenerative growers particularly. And then the other thing I would say is try and reduce down how much meat you're eating and move as much as you can to a plant-based diet. I think if we're trying to address catastrophic climate change, our diets are so much part of that solution, and our food is well, in fact, the drawdown, most of you have probably seen the drawdown projects, which essentially looks at all the top projects kind of globally to address catastrophic climate change, but the food system is right at the very top of that. And then the other thing I would say is please, please, please don't put food waste in landfill. One of the things that's so tragic, the most wasteful industry in the city of Melbourne is its food industry, more than building, more than offices, more than every other industry. And the thought that people would be putting a banana peel or something into landfill that's creating methane rather than keeping that precious nutrition in the system is just a tragedy. So I think we've got to be thinking about circular economies. And the circular economy work that the state is starting to do around its circular economy system is really exciting. But thinking about circular economies and food start to get really exciting, I think. And I'd love to see a bunch of that, emptied locations in the city that aren't tenanted now starting to have this wealth of kind of circular economy food products that are in them, because there's just so much opportunity for preserving and making products from that waste.
And actually, we're really good at our, pre-COVID, we got very good at our keep cups in Melbourne, but you probably are more across this than I am, Beck, but as I understand it, the environmental cost of the coffee grounds, if they go into landfill, are worse than using a disposable cup. So
I didn't know that,
there
but
could be some programs for coffee grounds pickup in the coffee capital of the world.
already
I don't
is.
know.
Well,
Reground.
there is. The
Reground.
rewildlings are part of all of that. Goes into a big orca, and we're just doing another one. Don't forget Queen Victoria Market, of course, if you're looking for local produce. But the point is made. I think we've also been slow on FOGO collections, so that's something that we'll be kicking off this year. Quite challenging in multi-storey dwellings, but nonetheless worth having a go. But I think in response to the question, really looking at each organisation, just examining, I love the theme for International Women's Day this year because it applies to everything, choosing to challenge your current procurement processes, the current stakeholders, the way that you engage, the energy that you use. And the other thing I was going to get Beck to talk about was just starting small. So if you want to do something different as an apartment dweller, I'm going to be learning how to have a little farm on my little balcony via Beck's program. And I think starting that way to really understand how we can do things differently in action starts a whole lot of other good habits as well. No pressure, Beck.
I'd also like to say to actually start doing some guerrilla stuff as well. And I know the city never likes to hear that stuff, but one of the reasons I love Berlin so much is that the residents start doing shit. They don't wait for local government to tell them can they or can't they do it. They go out onto their nature strips and they plant stuff. and they take back over buildings that aren't being used, and they have such a sense of ownership of public space. And I think that possibility to start to use, start to see all of that public space as your space. It's us pushing that, pushing equally against our lawmakers and our policy makers and saying, this is what we want our city to look like. We're not going to ask for permission. We just start doing it. So start guerrilla planting everywhere.
I'm up for that. I'm a Collingwood supporter, so a bit of elbowing, pushing and shoving is right up my alley. But of course, if it's led by the citizens, it's very, very powerful, so that's fantastic. Should have brought the gumboots with us today, Beck, by the sounds of it. A question here.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I must be in the wrong forum here because I thought this was a forum about job creation in Melbourne. Now, maybe I've got the wrong place, so I know where the door is and I'm happy to go. The first point I want to make is you've got empty shops here. The key is jobs. How are we going to get the jobs, That's pretty easy. I just step sideways, think of Auckland about, I say 20 years ago, and I might be having memory lapses. Auckland was a dead city. And they tried to work out how are they going to put themselves on the map. And they, in a space of 10 years, made themselves a 7-day-a-week, 24 hours a day city. All businesses were open, based on the boating industry. Here out the window here, we have miles of unused jetties. You can't tie up. We could get about 10, 20 super yachts in here tomorrow if we wanted to. Each super yacht spends about $5 million a month. You've got the whole waterfront unused. I can't tie a boat up, and you don't even allow any facilities to build here for boats. So there's a thing you could do without spending money. Just open up the waterfront. These super yachts are now all keeping out of Europe and America for some weird reason. They're all in the Pacific and got nowhere to go. Just open the door for them and say you've got free berthing. You'll have unlimited jobs and all the shops here will be full. What's the problem?
Sounds fantastic. So I look forward to hearing more about it. And what you've said at the start is absolutely right. It is about jobs. That's that point of having economic stimulation that comes through achieving other outcomes as well. So there's some of the social and environmental outcomes we've been talking about. But if we can become the home of jobs in new sectors and grow existing ones, fantastic. We're a waterfront city. I absolutely get it, and we neglect it completely. So if there's more we can be doing with super yachts, assuming they can get under the Balti Bridge, that would be absolutely fantastic. So I look forward to hearing more.
Can I add something in there, Sally? The reason that I run social enterprises is not because I want to feed rich people sourdough loaves of bread. That's my job. It's because there are tens of thousands of young people in this state who are going to be unemployed for the rest of their lives, given their skin colour and their postcode. And so what gets me out of bed every day is thinking about how do you create training and employment pathways into this food system. There were two really exciting pieces of research that were released during the pandemic. One was called the Clean Jobs Plan, and it was done by Alpha Beta Jobs. And it talked about the 76,000 jobs that needed to be created in Australia right now to green the country. And a third of those were low barrier to entry jobs. They were those vocational roles that someone who doesn't need to have finished year 12 or can have come as a refugee and migrant or can have dropped out of school at an early age or face barriers are suitable for. Another amazing plan was the Million Jobs Plan that was put out beyond zero emissions, and that once again painted an incredible opportunity for our country in green industries. And all of them have talked about anywhere from the renewable energy opportunities in this state through to the revegetation that we need to do through to the food system work. And I think if you haven't read them, they're really, really exciting plans because what they do is they address what's going to be decades of unemployment, and particularly for our most marginalised communities. If I go down right now to Dandenong and I sit outside Centrelink, I will be there watching an endless stream of young people who came to this country hoping for a better future and are going to be on welfare for the rest of their life. And it feels like an absolute travesty to have those young people that are facing the beginning of their life with so much potential sitting on welfare when we have so much work that's got to get done. So I totally agree with you. We've got to be clever about the way we use, the way we stimulate our economy, where we're putting that focus, but the training and employment pathways that are created, not just for people who could create those for themselves, but for people who are otherwise going to be left out of that for a really long time. So if you haven't read it, I'd recommend those 2 pieces of research because they're extraordinary.
And it is about sharing that opportunity right across the city. We're going to do one more question and then we're going to have to finish up. Thank you.
Oh, hi, I was just wondering in the short term, with going into winter and trying to get people back into the city, particularly families, whether you look at having free public transport every Sunday, with AFL coming back on, having reduced fees, maybe children for free in the zoo. I know you have to pay for all these things, but we came in on public transport today and we saw families coming in. There were a lot of young families, but I just thought even if you set up some sort of app type passport where you could have it for people who are cyclists and, you know, they get rewards when they get X number of coffees or something, or then you could have one where you bring in all the gardening for the children, where you can set up things not just a once off, but every Sunday, for instance, in Federation Square, you can teach the children to do all their eco gardening and that sort of thing, and have different facets for different interests. Get the families back in, have free public transport on a Sunday, just temporarily over the winter period, and you'll find that with more people coming into the city, it'll become more of a habit because they think, oh, it's free public transport, a bit like with the football. I think they had kids for free at one stage. You know, have your face painting and run it in with the AFL as well, have the zoos open, so you've got different facets for different interests, and just in a short term with some sort of passport app type thing.
Great idea, absolutely love it. One of the reasons that Moomba's been so important is bringing families and people back into the city, building up that COVID confidence and how we operate, and having an experience that means they want to come back. Certainly free public transport has been instrumental this weekend in supporting people coming into the city, and we're grateful to the state government for coming on board with that, as well as free parking around the city for those that need to drive. And that sense of accessibility. But really, I think what you're saying is presenting it in a way that is compelling for people to come in and to keep coming back in during winter. One of the great things about the city of Melbourne has always been that events-based economy that we have, and getting that sector up and running again after such a bleak 2020 is absolutely key. Across that visitor economy, so hospitality, retail and events, about 142,000 jobs of people clamouring to get back in. So how we can continue to promote it. This month, Moomba, Fashion Week, Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, Melbourne Comedy Festival, and then leading into big festivals like Rising, how we can help people understand the opportunities that are here and, as you say, help bring them in is really important. Did that give you time to come up with any responses or comments? Anyone here?
I'm all for free public transport. We'd have to buy it back though.
Yeah, we'd have to do a big structural change to make that happen. But let's think big. That's what it's all about. It does make a difference. Well, look, we are now over time. Thank you so much for coming along, for listening, for participating with questions, for giving us ideas. I've written a couple down while we were going. A very special thanks to our provocateurs today, to Jeremy, to Beck and to Pat. It's been fantastic to have you come along and paint pictures of what Melbourne can be like and ways in which we can move towards that. This is a really big conversation that we all have a vested interest in, and there are lots of ways to participate through these sorts of forums and many others on Participate Melbourne, and otherwise it's absolutely joyful to see you here in the city of Melbourne out and about. Thank you for sharing.